Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We look at conflicts all over the globe, week after week.
We certainly do.
And often, the really tough question, the one that keeps you up at night, isn't how did this war begin? It's more like how on earth does it actually end?
Right. What's the off-ramp? Is there even one?
Exactly. So today, we're really digging into that central puzzle. Why is it that some conflicts, wars that seem utterly hopeless, totally intractable, why do they sometimes find a path, maybe a really shaky, imperfect path, but still a path towards peace?
While others, and Ukraine is obviously the big example right now, seem to just settle into this horrifying, grinding stalemate that stretches on for years, just consuming lives and resources.
It's that difference we want to explore. What makes one situation move even slightly,
Yeah.
while another stays frozen in violence?
And our sources today argue it really boils down to the difference between, let's say, political pragmatism on one hand and a kind of rigid military ideology on the other.
Okay.
So this whole deep dive is focused on unpacking that argument. We're looking at what the sources call pragmatic peace.
Pragmatic peace. I like the sound of that. Less idealistic, maybe.
Definitely less idealistic, more about what's possible right now. So we'll contrast the recent Gaza peace plan, which our sources describe as highly imperfect, definitely not a final solution, but functional in some key ways.
Functional enough to stop the immediate bloodshed, maybe.
Precisely. We'll contrast that with the really frustrating, incredibly dangerous gridlock that we're still seeing in Eastern Europe and Ukraine.
Right. Okay, so let's really unpack this central idea, the core thesis you mentioned, the one connecting these situations. It's powerful stuff. And honestly, it runs counter to how a lot of people think about war, doesn't it? That desire for a clear win, a decisive victory.
It absolutely does. The common thread here, according to the analysis we're looking at, and maybe the only real path out of conflicts like Gaza and Ukraine, is to fundamentally reject that goal, to let go of the idea of total military victory. It's often elusive, incredibly costly in lives and treasure, and maybe, just maybe, not even achievable in many modern conflicts.
So instead of aiming for that perfect win,
Leaders need to embrace something else, a kind of political humility, a willingness to recognize a pretty brutal truth. That an imperfect peace, one that maybe leaves some issues unresolved, is still definitively better than pursuing a theoretically perfect destruction where everyone loses in the end.
imperfect peace is better than perfect destruction. That really hits home.
It's the core message. So we need to look really closely at what made the Gaza plan, work, even in its limited way. Not as some grand vision for the future, but as a practical blueprint. How did it stop the shooting right now?
And then take those lessons, however difficult they are, and see if they can be applied to Ukraine, which is, let's face it, a very different conflict, but also stuck.
Exactly. Apply those hard-won pragmatic lessons. The real challenge, of course, is convincing people, leaders, populations to settle for, say, 70% of what they want when they still believe 100% is somehow just around the corner if they fight a little longer.
That belief in the 100% solution is powerful, even when all evidence points against it. Okay, let's dive into part one then. The Gaza blueprint. What made that plan pragmatic? So the Gaza blueprint, the analysis we're looking at really emphasizes that this recent peace plan worked, or at least had a chance to work, precisely because it wasn't trying to be idealistic, it was deeply realistic. You called it strategic subtraction. Can you break down the key parts? What made it pragmatic in the eyes of these sources?
The realism fundamentally came from a willingness to surgically, almost painfully, defer the biggest, most existential goals. Those ultimate aims that have fueled the conflict for generations.
Like statehood.
Exactly. The plan deliberately pushed that long, elusive dream of a Palestinian state, the sort of grand final solution, way off into the future, to a much later stage.
And that wasn't easy, I imagine.
Not at all. It was basically an implicit admission, a really tough pill to swallow for many, acknowledging that right now, with the violence still echoing, the region simply wasn't ready for grand solutions. You couldn't build the penthouse while the foundation was crumbling.
So the pragmatism was in lowering the immediate ambition. Focus on stopping the fire before redesigning the whole house.
Precisely. The goal was to freeze the conflict first. Stop the killing. Stop the destruction. Not necessarily to solve the deep historical injustices right then and there. That had to wait.
That feels like the absolute crucial pivot, managing to slice through that tangled knot of history, identity, territory, all those things that have driven the fighting for decades. How did they get the parties involved to even consider setting aside those maximalist goals, even temporarily?
Well, getting them to consider is probably the right way to put it. It involved, as you said, tremendous diplomatic heavy lifting, behind-the-scenes pressure, assurances, maybe even some arm twisting from the mediators.
Okay.
But the key was shifting the immediate priorities. The absolute focus had to be on immediate stability. What does that mean in practice?
Stopping the shooting, I assume.
Number one, ending active hostilities. An immediate ceasefire. That's the baseline. Then, enabling robust humanitarian access, getting food, water, medicine to the suffering population. That part, the sources argue, had to be non-negotiable. People can't talk peace when they're starving or lack basic medical care.
Makes sense. Stop the bleeding, stabilize the patient.
Exactly. And then, only then, start laying the groundwork for what comes next. Essential reconstruction homes, hospitals, infrastructure, and maybe the hardest part over the long term, trying to figure out how to disarm the various extremist factions involved. That's a huge challenge, obviously deferred, but acknowledged as necessary.
So it's a sequence. Stop fighting, help people survive, rebuild basic structures, then tackle the really hard political and security stuff like disarmament.
Right. The sources are really clear on this. Focusing on stopping the suffering and restoring some semblance of physical order is the only foundation you can build on. You can't negotiate the big historical questions if people are still being bombed or their children are hungry. That immediate human need trumps everything else in pragmatic peace.
And to achieve that focus, that kind of strategic subtraction, it seems the type of mediator was critical. We often hear about the U.S., the EU playing roles.
Yeah, usual suspects.
But here the sources highlight something different. Non-Western mediation, specifically Qatar and Egypt. Why were they so crucial? Why did they have the credibility, the leverage to push this kind of agreement forward?
Their role was, according to this analysis, absolutely pivotal. You really can't overstate their influence in this specific context. They brought things to the table that, frankly, neither Israel nor the major Western powers could.
Like what specifically?
Diplomatic buy-in, for starters. Financial guarantees were also likely part of the package behind the scenes, but crucially cultural leverage. A deep, nuanced understanding that comes from being part of the region.
So it's more than just geography.
Oh, much more. It's genuine cultural and political fluency. They understand Gaza's internal dynamics, the social fabric and political undercurrents, as the sources put it, in a really granular person-to-person way. They know the families, the factions, the history. Washington or Brussels, operating from thousands of miles away, simply don't have that same texture of understanding. They might have satellite photos, but they don't have the same human intelligence network on the ground.
Can you give us a more concrete example of how that translates into actual leverage? How does knowing the social fabric help enforce a ceasefire?
Okay, think about the complex internal politics, especially among the non-state actors within Gaza. When Qatar or Egypt get involved, they're not just sending diplomats in suits. They often manage complex financial flows that keep parts of the society running. They have long-standing, sometimes decades-long, personal relationships with key tribal elders, political figures, even faction leaders.
So personal connections matter.
Hugely. They can leverage ideological ties, religious connections, direct economic support, or the threat of its withdrawal. So when they make a demand like stick to the ceasefire or allow this aid convoy through, it's not just a diplomatic request from an outsider. It's backed by the potential immediate withdrawal of essential resources or the loss of crucial political or social support networks within Gaza.
So the consequences are felt immediately, locally, not like waiting for some UN resolution.
Exactly. That's the regional leverage. It allows them to command compliance or at least apply pressure in a way that external actors relying mostly on threats of future sanctions or condemnation often can't. It helps ensure the peace, fragile as it is, feels more locally owned, not just like a foreign imposition that everyone ignores once the international attention shifts.
Which brings us to the outcome. If this pragmatic approach holds, if it's implemented, the sources describe the potential transformation as significant, but they're careful, very careful to call it fragile. What's the measure of success here for the average person in Gaza, and why the emphasis on fragility?
The success metric isn't, final peace and harmony. It's much more basic, more human. It's transforming Gaza from what one source calls a perpetual war zone into something resembling a functioning, if fragile, society.
Functioning meaning?
Meaning the basics are restored, dignity is restored, if reconstruction projects can actually start rebuilding homes, schools, clinics, if basic utilities like water and electricity are reliable again, if economic life, even tentatively, can resume, allowing people to earn a living, then ordinary Gazans Gazans might finally have a chance to rebuild their homes in dignity. That's the measure.
And the fragility, why is that word so important?
Because nothing fundamental has been solved yet. The really big, explosive issues, the final status of Gaza, the relationship with Israel, border security, the ultimate question of a Palestinian state, they haven't been resolved. They've just been deferred, pushed down the road.
So the plan's strength is also its weakness.
In a way, yes. Its greatest strength lies in its pure, immediate pragmatism. Stop the violence, save lives now, and figure out the intractable problems later. But that also means the underlying conflict drivers are still there, simmering beneath the surface. Any number of things could cause it to flare up again. Hence, fragile. It's a truce, a cessation of immediate hostilities, maybe a step towards something better, but it's not the final chapter.
Okay, so we have this Gaza blueprint, right? Magomedov, focused on immediate needs, regionally mediated, accepting imperfection. Now let's take that template, that mindset of strategic humility, and crash it right into the harsh reality of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, the contrast is, oh, well, it's jarring.
Because in Ukraine, the situation feels completely different. It's defined by this grim, exhausting stalemate, right? Cycles of destruction, defiance, territory changing hands slightly, but no decisive breakthrough. And yet, the sources we're looking at argue that the main international response, particularly from the West, seems stuck in a different gear altogether, suffering from what they call an illusion of military victory.
It is a profound contrast, almost tragic, really. In Ukraine, the dominant narrative supporting Western involvement, the flow of weapons and money, is still heavily rooted in this conviction or perhaps hope that a total military victory for Kyiv is still possible.
And total victory meaning?
Meaning the full restoration of Ukraine's 1991 borders, pushing Russia out completely, including from Crimea and the Donbas. The underlying belief seems to be that if you just provide enough sophisticated weapons, tanks, long-range missiles, drones, and combine that with crushing economic sanctions, you can eventually bend Russia's will, force them to give up.
But the analysis we're reading calls this a fundamental misconception.
A profound one, yes. The sources argue that pretty much every major actor involved, Washington, Brussels, Moscow, even Kyiv, privately knows, or should know, that a total military victory for either side is almost certainly impossible without utterly exhausting themselves, economically, demographically, socially. Pushing for that kind of total win risks a collapse that could be worse than a negotiated settlement.
So, the military path looks like a dead end, according to these analyses, yet the diplomatic path is maybe feared. Feared because it might look like rewarding aggression or appearing weak.
That's the bind. It leads directly to this contradiction, where the main non-military tool being used by the West, economic sanctions, comes under heavy fire in these sources. They're incredibly blunt about it. Sanctions aren't just seen as ineffective in achieving the political goal, but potentially as actively counterproductive.
Counterproductive? How so? I thought the point was to cripple Russia's war machine.
That's the theory. But the sources describe sanctions differently, not as a precise tool for diplomacy or compromise, but basically as just another form of warfare, non-kinetic warfare. Their primary design isn't to bring the other side to the negotiating table in good faith. It's to inflict pain on the adversary's economy and population.
Which sounds like an extension of military strategy, just without bullets.
Exactly. It's about coercion through economic pain. And the crucial point the sources make is that sanctions tend to punish economies, not ideologies. They hit the general population, they disrupt trade, but they rarely change the fundamental beliefs or strategic goals of a determined regime.
And the counterproductive part.
The consistent effect highlighted in the source material is that broad, punitive sanctions often harden rather than weaken political resolve. They give the targeted regime a powerful narrative to rally domestic support, so they end up functioning essentially as war by other means, prolonging the conflict rather than ending it.
Can you elaborate on that idea of hardening resolve? It seems counterintuitive. If people are suffering economically, wouldn't they pressure their government to change course?
You'd think so in theory, but in practice, especially in autocratic or semi-autocratic states like Russia, it often works the other way. Sanctions become a gift to the regime's propaganda machine. Instead of the government having to take responsibility for economic hardship or policy failures, they can simply point outwards. They tell their people, look, the West isn't just targeting our leaders or our policies, they're attacking you. They're attacking ordinary Russians. They want to weaken our nation, starve you into submission.
The external enemy narrative.
Precisely. It's a classic tool for consolidating power. It creates a rally around the flag effect. People might be suffering, yes, but they're told it's because of hostile foreign powers, not their own government's choices. This external threat narrative makes the economic pain politically useful for the regime, even if it hurts the populace. The pain is spread widely, but the political benefit, increased nationalism, reduced dissent accrues directly to the leadership.
So the very tool designed to weaken the regime politically might actually strengthen its grip on power internally.
That's the argument the sources make. Which is why they insist these broad sanctions are often counterproductive if the ultimate goal is actually to change the regime's policy or encourage a negotiated peace. They might degrade military capability over the long term, yes, but they don't necessarily create the political conditions for compromise.
Okay, so there's the efficacy argument, but the sources also hit hard on another angle. The perceived hypocrisy in how sanctions are applied, and how this creates a serious crisis of credibility for the West, particularly with the global South, those very nations that might be needed for any broader peace effort.
Yes, the hypocrisy angle is maybe the most damaging part of the critique in terms of long-term diplomacy. It really undermines the West's moral standing and persuasive power.
What's the specific example they use?
The sources point to a really glaring double standard. You had Western governments, particularly the U.S., threatening India with severe consequences like punitive 50% tariffs for buying discounted Russian oil.
Which for India is a major economic issue, right? Energy security for a massive population.
Absolutely. An economic necessity for a huge developing nation trying to keep its economy afloat amidst global inflation. Yet, at the very same time, these threats were being made against India.
Western nations were still buying Russian energy.
Some were. Europe, for instance, was still heavily reliant on and importing Russian natural gas, absolutely crucial for heating homes and running industries. And perhaps even more strikingly, the United States itself continued to purchase Russian uranium for its nuclear power plants.
Wow, okay. Threatening India over oil while buying Russian gas and uranium. It's difficult to explain away.
It's incredibly difficult to defend from a consistency perspective, and the sources argued this kind of behavior just reeks of colonial hypocrisy to many nations in the global South.
Colonial hypocrisy. Strong words.
They are, but they reflect a deep-seated historical sensitivity. The message it sends, intended or not, is that Western nations seem to preach rules, international norms, and moral standards when it serves their geopolitical aims, but they feel free to bend or break those same rules when their own strategic or economic interests are at stake.
And that perception damages trust.
Massively. The sources contend that this perceived double standard erodes Western credibility far more effectively than any anti-Western propaganda campaign could ever hope to achieve. When actions don't match words, especially from powerful nations, it alienates the very countries India, Brazil, South Africa, others in Asia and Africa whose cooperation might be indispensable for building a truly global consensus for peace, whether in Ukraine or elsewhere. The self-serving nature, even if unintentional, undermines the whole effort.
So if the Western approach is seen as perhaps ineffective with sanctions, potentially hypocritical and losing credibility in the global South, this logically leads to a need for a different approach, right? A fundamental paradigm shift, as the sources put it.
Exactly. If the framework that's dominated conflict resolution since World War II, largely led by the U.S. and Europe, is losing legitimacy or proving insufficient for this particular crisis, then you have to ask, who else has the potential leverage, the trust, the unique position to actually move the needle on Ukraine?
And the analysis points strongly towards
Asia, specifically towards the major civilizational powers who aren't locked into the NATO-Russia antagonism. The analysis insists that any realistic path to peace requires moving beyond that Western-centric framework and bringing India and China to the table in a central role.
India and China. Why them specifically? What unique leverage do they hold?
The argument is they are perhaps the only major players capable of doing two crucial things simultaneously: providing a degree of strategic reassurance or dignity to Moscow, which the West cannot, while also having the clout to guarantee Kyiv's future sovereignty and security in a way that feels credible to both sides.
Okay, let's break that down. Starting with India. The sources describe India as playing a potential bridge role. What makes New Delhi suited for this, and why is it seen as indispensable?
India's position is really unique. First, it has deep credibility across different ideological camps because of its long history of non-alignment. It doesn't automatically fall into the NATO camp or the Russia-China camp. It genuinely tries to maintain independent relationships.
So it's trusted, or at least listened to by both sides.
More so than many others, yes. But crucially, its relationship with Russia isn't just about buying oil. It's incredibly deep-rooted. We're talking decades of educational ties, thousands of Indian students and professionals educated in Russia. Military ties, a huge percentage of India's defense hardware is Russian origin. Cultural ties, historical goodwill going back to the Cold War.
So cutting ties with Russia isn't really an option for India.
The sources argue it would be tantamount to political suicide for any Indian government. The relationship is too broad, too deep, too strategically important. But this very dependence, paradoxically, gives New Delhi a unique voice in Moscow. They can deliver messages, perhaps even hard truths, that Washington or London simply cannot deliver without being immediately dismissed as hostile propaganda. India is seen as having its own interests, not just acting as a Western proxy.
Okay, so India brings non-alignment, deep historical ties, and therefore a unique channel to Moscow. It's seen as independent. How does China fit into this? Its relationship with Russia is also close, but different, right? More strategic alignment against the U.S.
China's involvement is framed slightly differently. It's seen as being driven primarily by its own intensely pragmatic strategic interests. Not necessarily out of love for Russia, but out of a desire for stability in its neighborhood.
Stability for?
Stability for Eurasia, which is absolutely essential for China's massive global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. An unstable, perpetually warring Ukraine, especially one drawing in NATO and Russia, directly threatens BRI trade routes, energy supplies flowing to China, and just generally creates geopolitical instability on its doorstep. It also sets a dangerous precedent for great power conflict that Beijing wants to avoid.
So China's interest is more about protecting its own economic and strategic projects.
Largely, yes. President Xi Jinping's dialogue with Putin, therefore, is seen as inherently pragmatic. It's about managing risk, minimizing disruption to China's long-term plans. And because of its economic weight and diplomatic clout, China certainly has the ability to press Moscow towards some kind of compromise if, and this is the key condition, if Beijing decides that such a compromise serves its own strategic goals better than continued conflict.
The goals being a stable Eurasia and avoiding getting entangled in escalating Western sanctions that might eventually target China itself.
Exactly. China wants predictability. Endless war in Ukraine offers the opposite. So if the conditions are right, China could be a powerful force for settlement, leveraging its economic relationship with Russia.
So if you bring these two giants, India and China, into the mediation process, what does the proposed new framework actually look like? Who else needs to be involved?
The source material sketches out a specific idea. A trilateral peace initiative, co-brokered by India, China, and, importantly, a genuinely neutral European state. Someone like Switzerland, perhaps, chosen specifically for its long history of diplomacy and its lack of NATO membership or direct military involvement.
India, China, Switzerland, an unusual trio.
It is unusual, deliberately so. And their entry wouldn't just be another mediation attempt. It would come with a powerful, non-negotiable precondition. They would demand, right from the start, a fundamental shift in mindset from the warring parties, primarily Kyiv and Moscow. A shift away from war logic, which is all about gaining territory, battlefield momentum, military advantage towards political logic.
Political logic meaning?
Meaning focusing on designing a guaranteed, stable future peace. What does the long-term political settlement look like? What are the security guarantees? What are the compromises needed? If the main parties aren't willing to make that fundamental shift from fighting to negotiating the future political reality, the trilateral group would simply walk away.
Threatening to walk away. Why is that important? Does it give them leverage?
Absolutely. It establishes their authority and their unique position. It makes it crystal clear that they are not just acting as messengers for the West or for NATO. Nor are they there to simply rubber stamp Russia's demands. Their interest is strategic. They want peace and stability for their own reasons. Regional stability, economic interests, global order. Not victory for one side or the other.
So it forces the belligerents, Ukraine and Russia, to take the process seriously, knowing these powerful brokers aren't beholden to either side's war aims.
Precisely. It changes the dynamic. The goal of this trilateral initiative wouldn't be to assign blame for the past or orchestrate a military victory. It would be to design a new, comprehensive security architecture for the region.
A new security architecture?
Yeah.
What would that have to cover to actually work to be sustainable?
It would need to address the core concerns of all the key players. That means accommodating NATO's legitimate security concerns about potential Russian expansionism in Eastern Europe. It means guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within whatever new framework is agreed upon. And, critically, it also means satisfying Russia's deep-seated, whether justified or not in Western eyes, sense of strategic dignity and its concerns about NATO bordering its territory. It has to be a package deal.
Finding a balance that addresses everyone's core security needs, even if nobody gets everything they want.
That's the essence of pragmatic peace. And here the sources make that really interesting counterintuitive point we touched on earlier. Achieving this kind of peace in Ukraine, despite the scale of the fighting, might actually be easier than finding lasting peace in Gaza.
That still sounds surprising. Why would Ukraine, with its massive front lines and geopolitical stakes, be considered easier?
Because the core issues in Ukraine, fundamentally, are about things that can be negotiated and verified politically. We're talking about borders, where does the line go? Geopolitical security guarantees who promises what to whom. Sovereignty, what does Ukrainian independence look like? These are incredibly difficult issues, don't get me wrong, but they are ultimately political and legal questions. They can be written down in treaties, monitored by international bodies, and enforced through agreements.
Whereas Gaza,
As the sources put it, is far more deeply entangled with identity, territory, religion, and a century of displacement. The conflict there touches on existential questions for both sides. It's not just about lines on a map, it's about competing historical narratives, religious claims, and the very right to exist in the same space. Those issues are much, much harder to resolve through purely political drafting. They require a deeper reconciliation that goes beyond treaties.
so Ukraine is a fiendishly complex political problem,
Right.
while Gaza is a deeply rooted existential problem.
That's a good way to summarize the argument. If the political will can somehow be mustered, and that's the giant if, Ukraine's conflict is, in theory, resolvable through pragmatic negotiation and compromise on security structures. But that requires moving decisively away from the military victory mindset that still seems dominant.
Okay, we've discussed the need for a new diplomatic framework, bringing in non-Western powers like India and China, focusing on political logic over war logic. But even if you have the right mediators, the sources point to massive internal barriers preventing a shift towards peace.
Yes, diplomatic architecture is one thing. Overcoming the internal forces that benefit from continued conflict is quite another.
And the analysis introduces a really powerful, almost ominous factor here, the shadow cast by the military-industrial complex, or MIC. That term, famously coined by President Eisenhower, warns about the influence of defense industries and military establishments on policy.
It's a stark reminder that war isn't just about geopolitics, it's also big business. The sources argue that this complex involving defense contractors, lobbyists, parts of the military establishment, supportive politicians, even some think tanks, essentially thrives on conflict. It needs threats, it needs instability, it needs wars, hot or cold, to justify its existence and its profits.
So for this complex, peace is actually bad for business.
From a purely economic perspective for those specific actors, yes, the sources are quite blunt. For elements within the MIC, endless war is preferable to an imperfect peace. Why? Because peace means shrinking defense budgets, canceled weapons contracts, fewer orders for tanks and missiles, shuttered production lines, and ultimately waning political influence for the lobbyists and companies involved. Conflict, on the other hand, generates predictable, often enormous, and sustainable profits.
And the analysis stresses this isn't just a Western phenomenon, that this dynamic applies in Russia, too, creating a really dangerous trap where Ukraine is caught in the middle.
Absolutely. It's not just a critique of Washington. While the U.S. economy is huge and diverse, Russia's economy is far more heavily reliant on a few key sectors: oil, gas, and arms sales. For Moscow, international tension, regional conflicts, proxy wars, these actually drive demand for Russian weaponry globally. They also keep energy prices volatile, which can benefit Russia's budget.
So both sides have powerful internal constituencies that benefit economically or politically from the conflict continuing.
That's the grim argument. Without the constant demand generated by conflict, the need for weapons, ammunition, repairs, replacements, technological upgrades, key parts of Russia's economic engine would sputter. So Ukraine finds itself caught between these two massive forces: the MIC in the West, which profits from supplying arms to Kyiv, and Russia's own economic dependence on arms exports and energy leverage, fueled by instability.
And the risk is that Ukraine becomes
The risk, as the sources warn, is that Ukraine becomes a perpetual battlefield. a place where external powers test weapons, drain adversaries, and pursue narratives of profit and geopolitical dominance, while Ukrainians themselves pay the ultimate price. It becomes a proxy war fought to the last Ukrainian, serving interests far beyond Kyiv.
To break free from that devastating cycle, the sources argue that leadership, particularly Ukrainian leadership, needs something more than just bravery. They talk about needing profound strategic imagination, going beyond that initial incredible courage President Zelensky showed back in February 2022.
Yes, Zelensky's initial defiance was absolutely historic, galvanizing, defining even. But leading a nation through a protracted war, especially one where outright victory seems impossible, requires a different kind of leadership. It requires daily strategic imagination. Meaning the ability, the courage to constantly reimagine the path forward, to see the negotiating table not as a sign of weakness, but as another kind of battlefield where Ukraine's future can be secured, even if it means making politically painful choices.
And the critique here is quite pointed, suggesting that Zelensky's circle might be too narrow.
The concern raised is that if Kyiv limits its primary strategic advice and counsel exclusively to its main military backers in NATO, specifically citing Washington, London, Brussels, the result can be policy echo chambers, not fresh perspectives.
Echo chambers, meaning they only hear reinforcement of the current strategy.
Potentially, yes. They risk hearing only what aligns with the backer's interests or worldview, which often emphasizes the military dimension because that's where the external support is focused. They might not get enough exposure to alternative viewpoints, especially those prioritizing difficult political compromises or mediation efforts led by non-Western powers. They might only hear what their funders, in a sense, want them to hear.
A failure to listen outside the established comfort zone, perhaps. The sources bring in an interesting parallel here, looking back at the end of the civil war in Nepal around 2005-2006. Why is that example relevant?
It's instructive because it shows a situation where external powers initially pushed for a military solution that wasn't working. In Nepal, the U.S., for instance, initially advocated strongly for arming the Nepalese government to militarily crush the Maoist insurgency. They saw it purely through a counterinsurgency lens, defeat the rebels.
But that didn't work.
No. The sources emphasize that given Nepal's geography, the nature of the insurgency, and the political landscape, a total military victory was simply impossible for either side. It would have just led to endless bloodshed in the mountains.
So how did peace come about?
Peace only arrived when all sides involved the government, the Maoist rebels, and crucially, the mediators, including India and the UN, finally acknowledged reality. They had to collectively reject the illusion of total military victory and consciously, deliberately embrace a messy, imperfect political process instead. That meant difficult compromises, power sharing, and integrating former enemies.
And the lesson for Ukraine?
The lesson, applied to Ukraine, is stark. Given Russia's sheer size, its massive military capacity, its nuclear arsenal, a purely military solution forcing Russia's total capitulation seems highly improbable, if not impossible, without catastrophic escalation. The sources even argue that the West's own restraint, carefully calibrating which weapons are sent, avoiding direct NATO involvement, tacitly confirms that even Washington knows a total military victory is unlikely or too dangerous to pursue fully. The military path looks like a road to perpetual stalemate, not victory.
So if the political path is the only viable one, even if it's difficult, the sources don't just say negotiate. They actually outline a very specific, quite bold, multi-step political roadmap that President Zelensky could theoretically take to try and break the stalemate, recognizing, of course, that this involves immense domestic political risk for him.
It requires a complete, probably agonizing paradigm shift for Kyiv's leadership and potentially for Ukrainian public opinion. It's a 6-step plan laid out in the analysis.
Okay, what's step one?
Step one is fundamentally personal and electoral. The suggestion is that Zelensky should explicitly seek a new mandate for peace. He should pledge to pursue a negotiated settlement, however imperfect, and run for president again on that specific platform.
Run on peace, not war.
Exactly. Get a new popular mandate from the Ukrainian people that explicitly endorses exploring political solutions, not just continuing the fight indefinitely. This would change the internal political dynamics, giving him the backing to make tough choices.
A mandate for negotiation.
Okay.
What's the biggest, most concrete geopolitical concessions suggested in this roadmap? The one that directly addresses Russia's stated concerns.
It's constitutional, and it's probably the bitterest pill for many Ukrainians to swallow. Formally deleting the clause in Ukraine's constitution that enshrines NATO membership as a primary national goal.
Removing the NATO aspiration from the constitution entirely.
Yes. The sources argue that keeping this clause, while perhaps understandable aspirationally, acts as a constant, unnecessary provocation from Moscow's perspective. It perpetually justifies Russia's narrative about NATO expansion and encirclement. Deleting it would be a major, tangible gesture towards de-escalation, a direct acknowledgement of Russia's historical security sensitivities, removing a key driver of the conflict. The sources frame it as almost a prerequisite, the price of admission, for getting serious, non-Western mediation off the ground.
Wow, that's huge. Okay, beyond the massive NATO question, how does this proposed plan address the deep internal divisions within Ukraine, the ethnic and linguistic issues, particularly in the East and South, that have fueled the conflict for years?
The plan calls for pretty radical internal restructuring, embracing federalization. Ukraine would need to grant broad political and cultural autonomy to all its diverse regions.
Federalization, like in Germany or the U.S., decentralizing power.
Something like that. Ensuring robust protection for language rights, cultural practices, local governance. And critically, this includes making Russian an official second language, at least for government administration and services, in those regions where it's widely spoken.
Recognizing the reality on the ground.
Exactly. It aims to address the demographic reality of the country and tackle decades of accumulated resentment, particularly over linguistic marginalization, which Russia has exploited. It's about making all citizens feel fully represented and respected within a unified but diverse Ukraine.
Okay, federalization, language rights. Now, the absolute toughest issue. What about the territories currently contested or under Russian control? Crimea, the Donbass.
This is probably the most complex and potentially explosive step in the roadmap, holding internationally supervised referenda in all the disputed territory.
Referenda
on their future status. But crucially, the sources insist these can't be simple stay or leave votes like the sham referenda Russia held. They must offer three clear, distinct, internationally verified options for the people living there.
3 options. What are they?
Option 1. Remain within a newly federalized Ukraine with constitutionally guaranteed autonomy and language rights. Option 2. Become an independent state with its neutrality internationally guaranteed, perhaps by the UN Security Council or the trilateral mediators.
Yeah.
Option 3. Join the Russian Federation.
Giving people a real choice, including independence, not just Ukraine or Russia.
Precisely. The idea is to genuinely empower self-determination under strict international supervision, thereby stripping Russia of its argument that annexation was the only way to protect the interests of the people in those regions. It puts the decision in the hands of the residents themselves after a period of stabilization and neutral administration.
For any of that to happen, the referenda, the return of people you'd need security on the ground, how does the plan propose achieving that?
This requires immediate, concrete military steps before any votes. Both Russian and Ukrainian forces would have to conduct a significant, coordinated withdrawal, not just pulling back a few kilometers from the current front line, but creating a deep buffer zone. The suggestion is perhaps 50 miles deep, completely demilitarized.
50 miles? That's a huge area. Who polices that?
The resulting neutral security zone wouldn't be empty. It would need to be immediately filled by robust United Nations peacekeeping forces. Critically, these peacekeepers should come primarily from neutral countries, likely those in the global south involved in the mediation, like India, perhaps Brazil, African nations, not from NATO countries or Russia's allies.
So, neutral boots on the ground.
Yes. Their job would be multifaceted: maintain order, prevent clashes, facilitate the safe return of refugees and internally displaced people so they can participate in the referenda, protect election monitors, and generally oversee the entire political transition process in the disputed regions.
Okay, mandate for peace, drop NATO clause, federalize, offer 3-way referenda under UN protection after a deep withdrawal. What about the sanctions? We established earlier the sources see them as counterproductive as a tool of war. How do they fit into this peace plan?
They get repurposed. Instead of being purely punitive, sanctions become a key incentive for peace. They are explicitly weaponized for peacemaking, not war-making.
How does that work?
They would be lifted gradually, step by step. But each step of sanctions relief would be explicitly and verifiably linked to tangible progress on the ground by Russia.
So compliance earns rewards.
Exactly. Progress in maintaining the ceasefire, completing the troop withdrawal from the buffer zone, allowing the UN peacekeepers full access, facilitating the referenda fairly, respecting the results, and complying with the overall political settlement. Each milestone achieved by Moscow triggers a pre-agreed measure of sanctions relief from the West and its allies.
So the sequence is critical. Political agreement first, then military withdrawal, then referenda, then gradual sanctions relief tied to compliance.
That's the proposed sequence. It shifts the economic calculus entirely. Instead of just inflicting pain indefinitely, it offers Russia a clear, verifiable pathway back towards economic normalization, but only in exchange for concrete steps towards peace and respecting Ukraine's choices within the agreed framework. It turns sanctions from a blunt instrument of punishment into a calibrated tool of incentivized diplomacy. Now, it's really important, having gone deep into the specifics of Gaza and the potential roadmap for Ukraine, to just step back for a moment to put this whole discussion about pragmatic peace and the failures of military solutions into a wider global context.
Broaden the lens a bit.
Exactly. The sources use two other powerful examples, one very current and tragically overlooked, and one historical, to really hammer home the core lessons about why external interventions often fail and why ignoring pragmatic, locally driven solutions is so dangerous.
Okay, before we get to those, maybe just quickly reiterate that counterintuitive point you made earlier, why the sources see peace in Ukraine as theoretically easier than in Gaza.
Right, it's worth repeating because it really frames the challenge. Ukraine, despite its horrors, is fundamentally about political arrangements. Borders, security guarantees, sovereignty, these are things humans can, in principle, negotiate and codify in treaties, even if it's incredibly hard. Gaza, by contrast, is so deeply entangled with those existential issues. Identity, competing religious claims, historical narratives of displacement going back generations. One side's narrative often feels like a denial of the other's very existence.
So, political problem versus existential problem.
That's the core distinction the sources draw, and the implication is sobering. If we, the international community, can't even manage to apply pragmatic peace principles to the fundamentally political problem in Ukraine, what realistic hope do we have for resolving the deeper, more existential tragedy unfolding in Gaza? It puts the Ukraine stalemate in an even more critical light.
A failure in Ukraine signals an inability to handle even the easier type of intractable conflict.
Okay.
So, where do the sources take us next to illustrate the dangers of not finding pragmatic solutions?
They shift focus to Southeast Asia, specifically to Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. And the analysis here is truly chilling. The sources label Myanmar as arguably the world's deadliest proxy conflict right now.
Deadliest. More so than Ukraine or conflicts in Africa. That's a strong claim, especially given how little media attention Myanmar often gets compared to others.
It is a strong claim, and it's based on the sheer complexity and lethality of the situation there, which operates on multiple overlapping layers of violence.
Okay, break down those layers. Why is it so bad?
First, you have the baseline tragedy. Myanmar is home to the world's longest-running ongoing civil war. We're talking 77-plus years of conflict between the central state, dominated by the Bamar ethnic majority, and its military, the Tatmadaw, and dozens upon dozens of distinct ethnic armed organizations, EAOs, representing various minority groups fighting for autonomy or independence. And this baseline conflict has massively intensified since the military coup in February 2021 ousted the civilian government.
So a decades-long internal war kicked into overdrive. That's layer one.
Layer one. Layer two is the intense international proxy element. Myanmar sits at a critical geopolitical crossroads, bordering both China and India, and near vital sea lanes. So it's become a key battleground for regional rivalries. You have China with deep economic and strategic interests, India concerned about border security and Chinese influence, Russia supplying arms to the junta, and the US and EU condemning the junta, supporting democracy movements, and sometimes tacitly backing certain EAOs. Everyone has proxies or is trying to maintain influence.
A chessboard for bigger powers. And layer three.
Layer three is the fuel that keeps the whole inferno burning.
Yeah.
Massive, entrenched criminal economies. These conflicts aren't just fought over politics. They're financed by illicit trade on an industrial scale. Myanmar has now tragically become the world's undisputed largest source of synthetic drugs, particularly methamphetamine, flooding the region and beyond. It's also still a major producer of heroin.
So the war is literally fueled by drug money.
To a huge extent, yes. Various actors, the junta, certain EAOs, transnational criminal syndicates profit enormously from the instability. The war economy, based on narcotics, illegal logging, jade mining, human trafficking, it creates a powerful incentive structure where perpetual conflict is actually profitable for those with guns. Peace would disrupt their business model.
Decades of civil war, layered with major power proxy games, all lubricated by a massive narco economy. That sounds like a nightmare scenario.
It's about the most fractured, complex, and self-sustaining conflict imaginable. You have maximum internal fragmentation among dozens of armed groups, intense foreign interference pulling in different directions, and these incredibly powerful criminal economies making violence pay. And yet, as you noted, it gets minimal international media coverage compared to, say, Ukraine or even Syria or Sudan, despite casualty figures and displacement numbers that are horrifyingly comparable.
Why the lack of attention?
Perhaps because it doesn't directly threaten European borders or involve a direct confrontation between NATO and a major rival in the same way Ukraine does. It's seen as a complex, messy internal conflict far away. But the sources use it as a terrifying case study. This is what happens when a conflict becomes perpetually outsourced to militias, becomes self-financing through crime, and festers largely hidden from the global public eye. It's a potential future for other conflicts if political solutions aren't found.
A chilling warning indeed.
Yep.
Okay, from the contemporary nightmare Myanmar, the sources then turn to history, to Afghanistan, the place famously or infamously known as the graveyard of empires. Why look back at Afghanistan?
To illustrate the ultimate repeated folly of trying to impose external solutions, especially military ones, without understanding or respecting local realities. Afghanistan serves as history's most consistent and brutal lesson in the limits of foreign power.
The pattern is well known.
Painfully so. You see it repeated over centuries. The British Empire, at its zenith, lost an entire army there in 1842, famously. Only one alleged European survivor made it back to tell the tale. The Soviet Union poured troops and resources in from 1979 to 1989, got bled dry in a long insurgency supported by the West and others, and the USSR itself collapsed just a couple of years after withdrawing.
And then the Americans.
And then the United States, after the 9/11 attacks, intervened in 2001. 20 years later, after investing trillions of dollars and thousands of lives, they departed in 2021, leaving the very group they went in to destroy the Taliban back in control of the country. The mountains, the tribal structures, the sheer resilience of the Afghan people, they don't bow easily to external force. They tend to outlast the invaders through sheer patience and local knowledge.
So what was the specific mistake the Americans made according to this analysis? Why did their 20-year effort ultimately fail, repeating the historical pattern? Was it just about the Taliban's resilience?
The Taliban's resilience was a factor, obviously, but the core failure identified in the source material was deeper. It was defined by a combination of strategic hubris and a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps dismissal, of Afghanistan's actual political culture and social structure.
How so? What did they misunderstand?
They failed because they tried to impose a replica republic onto Afghanistan. They attempted to build a centralized Western-style presidential system, headquartered in Kabul, modeled largely on Washington, D.C. It had a powerful president, a bicameral legislature, ministries, a national army and police force trained by foreigners, elections overseen by international bodies. All the trappings of a modern Western state.
And that model didn't fit.
It had absolutely no organic roots in Afghan political tradition or culture. Afghanistan has historically functioned, when it functions best, not as a centralized state, but as a loose collection of regions and tribes, often with power decentralized. So instead of imposing this foreign template, the sources argue, the U.S. and its allies should have focused on nurturing an Afghan form of democracy, something that resonated with local traditions.
And what would that have looked like? What's the alternative model described?
The sources describe it as something closer to a tribal federation, a system that acknowledges and works with, rather than against, the existing decentralized power structures.
Can you detail that contrast?
Yeah.
How does a tribal federation function differently from the replica republic they tried to build?
Okay, the replica republic they built was highly centralized in Kabul. Power, money, and decision-making were concentrated there. This inevitably led to massive corruption, alienation of regional leaders and populations, and a sense that the government was distant and imposed by foreigners. A tribal federation, by contrast, would have built legitimacy from the ground up by empowering the traditional local councils, the jirgas and shuras. These councils are where consensus is built, disputes are resolved, and local governance actually happens in much of rural Afghanistan. A pragmatic approach would have recognized the power of the jirgas, perhaps formalized their role, and built a national structure based on representation from these local bodies. Maybe each major ethnic group or region elects its own leader through its traditional processes, and those leaders then form a national council or elect a national president with limited defined powers.
So power flows up from the communities, not down from Kabul.
Exactly. And critically, this applies to security too. Instead of trying to build a national army often seen as dominated by one ethnic group or loyal only to Kabul, they could have integrated local militias and tribal forces under traditional decentralized command structures, perhaps functioning like local police or regional guards, loyal to their communities but coordinated nationally. Maybe even groups like the Taliban could have been assimilated into local security roles in some areas, rather than being treated solely as an enemy to be eradicated everywhere.
A radically different approach, building on existing structures instead of replacing them.
Radically different and arguably far more likely to have achieved sustainable stability. The ultimate lesson the sources draw from Afghanistan, and it applies broadly, is about the nature of true power and the danger of arrogance.
What is that lesson?
The sources state that real effective power, especially when dealing with complex societies different from your own, lies in restraint. It lies in listening, genuinely listening to local voices and understanding local solutions, not just in lecturing, imposing, and controlling.
But the American approach was mostly the opposite.
Largely, yes.
Wow.
That addiction to control, the belief in the universal applicability of Western models, the desire to reshape Afghan society in America's image. It didn't build genuine, resilient democracy. Instead, it built dependency. A dependency that required endless flows of foreign aid and military support, which, perhaps not coincidentally, benefited the contractors and elements of the military-industrial complex back home.
Creating a system that served external interests as much as, or maybe more than, Afghan interests?
That's the implication. The cost was astronomical, trillions of dollars, countless Afghan and coalition lives lost. And the end result, a return to the status quo ante, proving that democracy, like a tree, cannot be simply airlifted and planted. It has to grow from the soil of its people. The sources end the Afghan section with a powerful image. The invincible simplicity of the Afghan farmer, tied to his land and traditions, is ultimately his strongest armor against any foreign ideology or invading army. Humility and local knowledge win in the end. #outro.
So reflecting on this entire deep dive, we've journeyed through some incredibly complex and tragic conflicts. From the immediate pragmatic steps taken in Gaza to the frustrating stalemate and the proposed political roadmap for Ukraine, the cautionary tale of Myanmar's fragmentation, and the historical lessons from the graveyard of empires in Afghanistan.
It's a wide sweep, but there's a remarkably consistent thread running through all of it.
And that thread seems to be, what's the single biggest takeaway from looking at all these different situations through the lens of pragmatic peace?
I think it's this. The greatest challenge in actually resolving these devastating conflicts isn't usually the technical difficulty of drafting a peace plan. You can always find lawyers and diplomats to write words on paper. That's often the relatively easy part, believe it or not.
The real bottleneck lies elsewhere.
The real difficulty, the real test, is mustering the necessary political courage. The courage required from leaders on all sides to actually implement pragmatic, often deeply imperfect plans. Plans that inevitably require major players to step back from the alluring illusion of total military victory, to swallow hard compromises, and to accept a messy, partial political settlement instead of holding out for a perfect win that may never come.
It's that painful but necessary shift you mentioned earlier, from war logic to political logic. Making peace requires a different kind of bravery than waging war.
A much harder kind, perhaps, especially, as we discussed, when you have powerful systemic forces like the military-industrial complex on multiple sides actively profiting from the continuation of conflict. Endless war can be very good business for some.
We saw how the Gaza plan, at least in theory, tried to sidestep the utopian dreams by focusing on immediate, life-saving practicality, using regional mediators who had local credibility, isolating the essential first steps needed to restore basic order.
And Ukraine, by contrast, seems desperately in need of that kind of strategic imagination. A willingness from its leadership, potentially backed by a new mandate, to consider politically dangerous concessions like formally dropping the NATO clause, or seriously exploring federalization, or embracing UN-supervised referenda as the price for a sustainable, negotiated peace.
Even if those steps are incredibly difficult domestically and internationally.
Especially then, because the alternative seems to be endless stalemate or catastrophic escalation. The path to stability, the sources argue, whether you're talking about the valleys around Kabul or the trenches in the Donbass, requires the major global powers to do two things they often struggle with.
Which?
First, apply one moral and legal standard consistently to everyone, including themselves, to rebuild credibility, especially with the global South. Stop the perceived hypocrisy. Second, Finally, start listening to local realities, local needs, and local solutions, instead of just lecturing or imposing solutions from distant capitals based on their own interests or ideologies.
Because that refusal to listen, that imposition of external models,
It breeds resentment, creates dependency, fuels corruption, and ultimately feeds the cycle of endless proxy battles. It risks turning sovereign nations into perpetual battlefields where external powers play out their rivalries at the expense of the local population.
So we should probably leave our listeners with a final thought to chew on, something that encapsulates this whole discussion about pragmatism versus ideology, peace versus profit.
I think the final provocative question the sources leave us with is this. If the world's most powerful nations, East and West, continue to define success primarily in terms of military dominance, geopolitical control, expanding their spheres of influence, and maximizing profit margins from conflict, how long can that last? How long until their own carefully constructed illusion of control shatters and falls?
Just as history seems to predict it eventually will, whether it's in the mountains of Afghanistan or perhaps closer to home.
Exactly. It really boils down to a fundamental choice. Can political humility, a pragmatic acceptance of limits, finally overcome the seductive arrogance of power and the desperate, urgent pursuit of peace? Or are we destined to keep repeating the same tragic mistakes? That's the question to keep asking.